And here is an excerpt of my story, The Devil Went Down to Surrey, from the Amex Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories, Part 35, edited by David Markham. I hope you enjoy it. Over the years, various and sundry clients have visited the rooms of Sherlock Holmes at 221B Baker Street, all with problems for the great detective to solve. Some clients, such as Mr. Jabez Wilson, cut comical figures, while others were tragic ones. Perhaps the oddest clients of all came to Holmes in the year 1896. The reader will remember the story of Mr. Robert Ferguson, but may be quite unfamiliar with the case of Signor Gianni Rossi. The events of his tale, the one I am about to relate, were among the strangest Sherlock Holmes has ever faced. For not only did he find himself protecting the life of a man, he found himself guardian of his very soul. Holmes and I had spent the early October evening at St. James Hall, and upon our return to Baker Street found Mrs. Hudson waiting for us at the front door. "There is a gentleman waiting for you, Mr. Holmes," she said. "I told him you'd gone out for the evening, but he insisted on staying. He's been here for more than an hour, pacing back and forth like a caged lion." "His problem must be a desperate one indeed," mused Holmes. "Come, Watson, let us meet this fellow." We hurried up the stairs and soon entered our rooms. A thin young man, clad in disheveled clothing, sat upon the settee, wringing his hands. He rose as he entered and gazed at us with wide, frightened eyes. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "thank heavens you've come." He moved to take my friend's hand, but the effort appeared to be too much. His eyes rolled up in his head, and he fell to the floor. I rushed to the fellow's side and quickly loosened his collar. A few sips of brandy from my flask soon revived him, and Holmes and I helped him back to the settee. "I must apologize," he said. "I have never fainted before, not ever." "It is no matter," Holmes said. "Rest yourself here, Senor Rossi. You know me? What admirer of the violin does not? You are Gianni Rossi, a prodigy whose talent rivals that of Sarasat. I see you have recently returned from Camberley and Surrey. The country air did little to improve your health. You haven't been eating or sleeping well for the past week." Rossi's eyes grew wider, his face pale. "How do you know of my visit? I told no one." "The return ticket in your top pocket reveals you departed from Camberley this morning at 11 o'clock." Rossi glanced down and then back up into my friend's face. "And what of my health? How do you know I haven't been sleeping or eating?" "Your suit is new, but a trifle loose-fitting. Judging by the stitching, your sauteur is an experienced one. The material is an expensive weave, and no such person would have created such ill-fitting apparel. Therefore, you have lost weight. That fact and your collapse led me to the conclusion that you have not eaten as much as you should. As to your lack of sleep, your eyes tell all. There are shadows beneath them, and you can barely keep them from closing." Something like relief passed over Rossi's face. "Ah, it is as simple as that. When you spoke before, it seemed as though you had somehow seen me into my mind. I thought you were one of his minions sent to spy on me." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Minions?" "My story is a fantastic one, that I will admit. You may not believe a word I have to say, but perhaps you will help me all the same." "You should eat first," I interjected, "and regain some of your strength." "Watson is a doctor," Holmes said. "It would do you good to heed his advice." "Dr. Watson? Ah, yes, the biographer of Mr. Holmes. Please accept my apologies. I should have known you right away." "Think nothing of it," I said, and hurried down to speak with Mrs. Hudson, who, as luck would have it, hadn't yet turned in. She prepared a cold supper of chicken, one which Rossi consumed with gusto. He was quite ravenous, and the salt shaker slipped from his fingers several times during his efforts to consume the fowl. Each time he dropped the shaker, he would toss a pinch of salt over his left shoulder. It was a rather amusing sight, but I didn't laugh nor even smile. The young man seemed quite serious about this superstitious action, and I had no wish to annoy him. When he had finished, I poured him a glass of brandy and began his astounding tale. "All of my life I have striven for perfection. I suppose the trait is something handed down to me by my mother, a beautiful and uncompromising Englishwoman. She drummed the idea into me day and night and day. My father, on the other hand, was a gentle fellow, and an Italian musician of some renown. He was also a friend of Saze. He convinced the great man to tutor me in Paris, and I found myself there at the age of 6. 11, I performed at the Conservatoire. At 16, I toured the continent. My parents often traveled with me, but during a concert in Venice, they were killed in a railway accident. I had taken an earlier train with my mother's solicitor, James Marston, or I would have shared their fate. After the death of my parents, I floundered. I lost all interest in my art and would perhaps have melted into obscurity had a legend of my childhood not reinvigorated me. As a boy, I had heard of a violin, a Stradivarius, of amazing and impeccable quality. It was considered an instrument without flaw, one which only the greatest musician could play. Performers had whispered and dreamed of it for years, and I resolved that I would have it. The bulk of my finances was not mine to do as I pleased during this time. My parents had placed them into a trust, one which would become available to me upon my 21st birthday. I was, however, allowed a small stipend each month, administered to me by Mr. Marston. I used this money to fund my research, one which consumed my every waking hour. Mr. Marston did not approve of my endeavors. He believed that I should return to the art I had abandoned. Dear God, how I wish I had followed his advice. If I had, I wouldn't fear for my life, nor my salvation, and the evil one would not hold no sway over me. Holmes had taken his chair before the fire while Rossi spoke, and had stretched his legs before him in that languid form he always adopted when listening to a case. He now leaned forward, an eager gleam in his eyes. For months, I pored over manuscripts and letters, searching for the location of the treasured Stradivarius, Rossi continued. I visited libraries in Paris, Venice, and Berlin before making my way here to my mother's homeland. Here I stayed, and for the last 2 years have searched. When my studies yielded nothing, I wrote to the greatest academics and musicians of the day. Last November, a professor emeritus from Durham College, one Jasper Hedgewick, replied to me and revealed that the violin did in fact exist. He said it belonged to an English gentleman in Surrey. I was ecstatic at this news and wrote him right away, asking for the man's name. To my great disappointment, the professor refused my request. He said the man in question was one of dubious demeanor and eccentric habits, one I should stay well clear of. I went to see him after that, hoping that I might change his mind. The fellow was a kindly man with a bald head and graying hair at the sides. It took some time to convince him. When his resolve weakened at last, he gave me the name of the gentleman in question. It was Mr. Lazarus Scratch, of the Willows, Camberley. Mr. Marston believed my quest to be a foolish one. He counseled me against meeting this man, but I wouldn't be dissuaded. He was quite angry when I revealed my plans to him. And what did these plans involve? Holmes inquired. After my meeting with the professor, I saved my allowance for 3 months and built up a tidy sum. This I intended to give Lazarus Scratch in return for the Stradivarius. Knowing how my guardian felt about the situation, I stole off early, Monday morning, so that he couldn't bar my departure. I took the train, expecting to hire a dog cart upon my arrival. To my great surprise, I found a carriage waiting for me. I arrived at Mr. Scratch's home around 8:30. The manor was a great round one with white walls, green shutters, and a flourishing rose trellis. 2 large willow trees flanked the door. I don't mind telling you, my heart sank when I saw it. It seemed Mr. Scratch had far more resources than I had given him credit for. My meager savings couldn't buy the Stradivarius from him. I was sure of that. I would have to find a different way to acquire it. My first meeting with Mr. Scratch was a strange one and unnerved me greatly. He was an imposing man with hair bleached by the sun. It had hung about his face, giving him an almost angelic appearance. Like you, Mr. Holmes, it seemed he knew things about me he shouldn't know. I had told no one of my plans to visit Camberley, and yet he expected me. A room painted in my favorite colors awaited me, and my favorite dish, pasta alla norma, was served for dinner. He knew my favorite wine, what I imbibe only on special occasions, and even had a suit made for me, the one I am now wearing. As you observe, Mr. Holmes, it was at one time tailored to my exact measurements. When I asked him how he knew these things, he grinned, revealing a row of pointed white teeth. I have my secrets, Gianni, he replied. May I call you Gianni, or would Noki serve you better? The mention of my childhood name, the one used only by my father, chilled my blood. I didn't respond, but stared at him speechless. He laughed then. The sound did little to warm me. Dear boy, he said, do not take on so. I have ears and eyes all over the world. That is how I've learned of you. It is also how I've learned of your obsession. Come, I will show her to you. He led me from the dining room into a large room I can only describe as a library or study. Each shelf was filled with leather-bound tomes, jewels, cups fashioned from gold, and many other treasures. A rich Persian carpet covered the floor, and heavy black drapes covered the windows. Oil lamps lit the room, creating a tasteful balance between light and shadow. On the wall, behind the African teakwood desk, hung the Stradivarius. The glow from the nearby oil lamp flickered over it. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Mr. Scratch crossed to the wall and took it in his hands. "Beautiful, isn't she?" he crooned. I reached out for the Stradivarius, desperate to touch the woods, to feel the strings under my fingers, and to clutch it beneath my chin. He held it just outside my reach, a smile playing about his lips. "I am sorry, Johnny. I cannot allow you to hold her. She is my prized possession, the highlight of my collection. I have owned her since she entered the world. I cannot suffer another to touch her." I nodded, the disappointment once again flooding my heart. I felt as though I were drowning in it. Mr. Scratch placed the violin beneath his chin and pulled the bow across the strings. The melodious sound filled me with peace I had never known. When he finally ceased, I realized the midnight hour had come and gone. I licked my lips. My mouth had suddenly gone dry. Mr. Scratch turned, and I took hold of his arm. "You would never part with it? Not for any price?" He turned and grinned at me over his shoulder. There was something fiendish in that smile. If I had been in my right mind, I would have let him go, would have fled the house. Unfortunately, I had already been bewitched. "There is a trust in my name," I said. "One I shall have access to in but a few days. It is a substantial fortune. Not only does it contain moneys earned by me, it also contains the fortune of both my parents." He shook his head. "It isn't enough." "Please, I will give you anything. I must have it. Name your price." He cocked his head to one side and stared at me for a long while. "I don't think you could pay it," he said at last, and ushered me from the room. For 2 days I begged and cajoled Scratch for the Stradivarius, and for 2 days he rebuffed me. On the third, he forbade me from speaking of it again. If I did, he would have me banished from the house. That night, as I sat brooding in my room, a terrible plan formed within my mind. I had observed the library for the past few nights and noticed that no guard had been set outside the door, nor in the room. What's more, the household, consisting of a butler and 3 maids, often turned in at 9 o'clock and didn't rouse until 5. The Stradivarius was unwatched during these hours, and no one might notice its disappearance during the night. "I see by your expression, Dr. Watson, that you are shocked by my behavior. I have no excuse for my actions, though I assure you I have suffered mightily for it. There is no taking back what I have done. I can only tell you of how I crept from the room, my ears straining for any sound, and made my way down the passage to the library. I shielded the candle I carried with one hand, afraid that its glow might alert those whose doors I passed. The hall seemed to go on forever, and I was quite relieved when I reached the door to the library undiscovered. The door opened on quiet hinges when I slipped inside. The room was lit by a single oil lamp. It illuminated the Stradivarius and nothing else. I approached it, my heart in my throat. I set the candlestick on the desk and reached up to retrieve the instrument from the wall. Only seconds lay between me and it. And then, to my utter horror, a voice sounded behind me. I turned and found a shadow seated in the chair near the window. I knew at once to whom it belonged. "I am disappointed, Rosie," Scratch said. "I had such high hopes for you. It seems the temptation was too great." You can imagine my shame, gentlemen. I couldn't speak a word. I simply stood there like a chastened child. Scratch rose from his chair and approached me. When he came into the lamplight, he wore a strange expression on his face, as though he thought the situation a humorous one. "In my time, I have seen a great many desperate men," he said. "Men who would give all for the love of a woman, for the taste of power, for unbridled wealth. I have never seen a man who would give everything for perfection." He circled at me as he spoke, and as though his voice held no anger, I couldn't look him in the eye. "What would you give for it, Johnny?" he asked in a low tone. I glanced up, and in a bold voice declared, "Everything." He nodded. "Suppose we were to have a contest. If you win, I shall give you the Stradivarius. What will you give me should I win?" "Since you will not take my money, perhaps you will take my violin. I have it upstairs in my room." Scratch shook his head. "No, no, that will not do. That will not do at all. My Stradivarius is one of a kind, and I have no use for another instrument. What will you take as payment, then? You have only to name it, and it shall be yours. He nodded, and that strange grin spread over his face once more. Very well, Signor Rossi. It shall be done. If I win, I take your soul. And that was an excerpt from the MX Book of New Sherlock Holmes Stories, edited by David Markham. And I hope you enjoyed my reading here at Stokercon. Thank you for listening, and have a good day.